Sarah Mitchell had always been small for her age. At 17, she barely reached 5 feet 2 inches, with delicate features that made her look even younger. Her grandmother used to say she had the face of an angel, but Sarah knew better. Behind those soft brown eyes lay something much harder, forged in the fires of necessity and survival. The moving truck pulled away from the curb, leaving Sarah and her mother standing in front of their new house in Millbrook, a small town where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business before they even knew it themselves. The house was modest, a 2-bedroom rental with peeling paint and a front porch that creaked under the weight of their moving boxes. "Fresh start, baby girl," her mother, Linda, said with forced optimism, tucking a strand of graying hair behind her ear. The bruises on her wrists had faded to yellow, but Sarah could still see them if she looked close enough. "This time will be different." Sarah nodded, though she'd heard those words before. 3 moves in 4 years, each one promising a new beginning, each one ending the same way. But this time, Sarah had made herself a promise. This time, she wouldn't let anyone hurt her family again. The next morning came too soon. Millbrook High School loomed before her like a fortress of brick and judgment. Students clustered in their familiar groups across the front lawn, their voices carrying on the crisp autumn air. Sarah pulled her worn backpack higher on her shoulders and walked toward the main entrance, trying to ignore the stares that followed her. "Look at the new girl," she heard someone whisper. "Looks like a strong wind could blow her over." Sarah kept walking, her sneakers silent on the concrete steps. Inside, the hallways buzzed with the energy of teenagers who had known each other since kindergarten. Lockers slammed shut, friends called out greetings, and teachers hurried past with arms full of papers. Sarah found her locker and worked the combination, aware that several students had slowed their pace to get a better look at her. "You lost, little girl?" The voice belonged to a tall boy with carefully styled hair and a Letterman jacket that probably cost more than Sarah's entire wardrobe. His friends flanked him like bodyguards, their expressions ranging from amused to predatory. "No," Sarah said quietly, continuing to organize her books. "This is a high school, you know. Elementary school is across town." The comment drew snickers from his audience. Sarah turned to face him, taking in his confident posture and expectant smile. She'd met boys like him before, boys who thought their size and status gave them the right to intimidate anyone they saw as weak. Boys who reminded her too much of the men her mother seemed to attract. "Thanks for the information," she said, her voice steady. "I'll keep that in mind." The boy's smile faltered slightly at her calm response, but he recovered quickly. "What's your name, new girl?" "Sarah." "Well, Sarah, I'm Derek Hoffman. My dad owns half this town, so if you need anything, you just let me know." His tone suggested that his help would come with strings attached. "I'll remember that, too." Derek leaned against the lockers, clearly not used to being dismissed so casually. "You know, you're pretty cute. Maybe I could show you around, help you fit in." "That's kind of you, but I can manage." The dismissal in her voice was clear, and Derek's expression darkened. His friends exchanged glances, sensing the shift in mood. In a school like Millbrook High, respect was currency, and Derek had just been publicly denied. "Listen, new girl," Derek said, his voice dropping to a more threatening tone. "This isn't the kind of place where you want to make enemies on your first day." "I was being nice." Sarah closed her locker and turned to face him fully. Something in her eyes made Derek take an unconscious step backward, though he quickly covered it by crossing his arms. "And I was being polite," Sarah said. "But if you prefer honest, I can do that too." Before Derek could respond, the first bell rang, and the hallway began to empty as students hurried to their classes. Sarah shouldered her backpack and walked away, leaving Derek and his friends standing by the lockers, unsure of what had just happened. Her first few classes passed in a blur of introductions and curious stares. Teachers asked her to share something about herself, and she offered the same rehearsed response. Moved from Colorado, looking forward to being part of the Millbrook community, interested in keeping a low profile and focusing on her studies. At lunch, Sarah found a quiet table in the corner of the cafeteria, away from the main social clusters. She pulled out a sandwich from home and a worn paperback novel, content to eat in solitude while observing the social dynamics around her. The cafeteria was a perfect microcosm of high school hierarchy. The athletes dominated the center tables, their voices loud and their gestures expansive. Nearby sat the student government types, discussing weekend plans that probably involved college prep courses and volunteer work. The theater kids clustered near the windows, their animated conversations punctuated by dramatic gestures and bursts of laughter. And then there were the others, the quiet kids who ate alone, the ones who didn't quite fit into any defined category, the ones who had learned that invisibility was often the safest option. Sarah recognized them because she'd been one of them before in other schools, in other towns. "Mind if I sit?" Sarah looked up to see a girl with short black hair and glasses, holding a lunch tray with the confidence of someone who was used to approaching strangers. She was Asian, probably Korean, with an easy smile and eyes that suggested intelligence and humor. "Sure," Sarah said, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. The girl sat down and extended her hand. "I'm Jenny Park. You're the new girl everyone's been talking about. Sarah Mitchell. And what exactly are they saying? That you shot Derek Hoffman down in flames this morning." Jenny's grin widened, which, by the way, was long overdue. That guy thinks every girl in school should be grateful for his attention. Sarah took a bite of her sandwich, considering her response. "He seemed to think I should be impressed by his father's real estate holdings. His father owns Hoffman Development. They've built most of the new subdivisions around here." Jenny leaned forward conspiratorially. "But between you and me, the family's not as powerful as they like people to think. Derek just acts like he owns the place because no one's ever called him on it. Until today." Until today. Jenny raised her milk carton in a mock toast. "Here's to calling out entitled jerks." Sarah found herself smiling despite her usual caution around new people. There was something genuine about Jenny that reminded her of her best friend back in Denver, before everything fell apart. "So what brought you to our little slice of paradise?" Jenny asked, the question Sarah had been dreading all day. The truth was too complicated, too painful, and too personal to share with someone she'd just met. Her mother's latest boyfriend had turned violent, and their hasty departure had been more escape than relocation. The restraining order they'd left behind was just a piece of paper, and Sarah knew from experience that men like Marcus didn't respect legal boundaries. "My mom got a job opportunity," Sarah said, which was technically true. Linda had found work as a night shift nurse at Millbrook General Hospital, a job that would keep her busy and away from the local bar scene, where she tended to meet the wrong kind of men. "What does she do?" "She's a nurse." Jenny nodded approvingly. "We can always use good medical people around here. The hospital's been understaffed for years." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Derek Hoffman and 3 of his friends. They approached the table with the swagger of young men who were used to getting their way through intimidation. Well, Derek said, his voice carrying across the nearby tables. "Looks like the new girl found herself a friend." Jenny's expression hardened. "Move along, Derek. We're trying to eat." "I wasn't talking to you, Jenny." Derek's attention remained fixed on Sarah. "I was thinking maybe I didn't make myself clear this morning. See, in a small town like this, it pays to have friends in the right places." Sarah set down her sandwich and looked up at him calmly. "And it pays to recognize when someone isn't interested in your friendship. You know what I think?" Derek's voice grew louder, drawing attention from other tables. "I think you're confused about how things work around here. Maybe where you came from, girls could act all high and mighty, but this is Millbrook. And what exactly does that mean?" Derek's friends spread out slightly, creating a semicircle around the table. The body language was clear, intimidation through numbers and positioning. Sarah recognized the tactic immediately. She'd seen it before in other schools, in other confrontations. "It means you show respect to people who've earned it," Derek said. "And in this school, I've earned it." Jenny started to stand up, her face flushed with anger, but Sarah placed a gentle hand on her arm. "It's okay," she said quietly. "No, it's not okay," Jenny protested. He can't just what?" Derek interrupted. "I'm having a conversation with your new friend here. Nothing wrong with that." Sarah stood up slowly, her movement fluid and controlled. Despite her small stature, there was something in her posture that gave Derek pause. She met his gaze directly, unflinching. "You're right," she said. "There's nothing wrong with conversation. But there's something wrong with trying to intimidate someone because they hurt your feelings." "My feelings aren't hurt," Derek said quickly, his voice rising slightly. "Good. Then, there's no problem." Sarah gathered her books and stood to leave. "Come on, Jenny." "Hold on," Derek said, reaching out to grab Sarah's arm. The moment his fingers made contact with her wrist, something shifted in Sarah's demeanor. The change was subtle, but unmistakable. Her body went very still, and when she looked at Derek's hand on her arm, her expression became unreadable. "Let go," she said quietly. There was something in her tone that made Derek hesitate. It wasn't fear or pleading. It was a warning, delivered with the calm certainty of someone who had faced much worse than a high school bully. "Or what?" Derek said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Sarah looked up at him, and for just a moment, Derek saw something in her eyes that made his stomach clench with unexpected nervousness. It was the look of someone who had been pushed too far, too many times, by people much more dangerous than him. "Just let go," she repeated. Derek released her arm, stepping back with a forced laugh. "See? That wasn't so hard. We can be friends after all." Sarah gathered her things without another word and walked away, Jenny hurrying to catch up with her. Behind them, Derek and his friend stood in awkward silence, uncertain about what had just transpired, but somehow aware that they had witnessed something significant. "Are you okay?" Jenny asked as they left the cafeteria. "I'm fine," Sarah said, though her hands were shaking slightly as she adjusted her backpack straps. "That was intense. Derek's used to people backing down when he gets aggressive." Sarah nodded, but didn't trust herself to speak. The feeling of Derek's hand on her arm had brought back memories she'd spent months trying to suppress. Marcus grabbing her mother during their arguments, his fingers leaving bruises that Linda tried to hide with makeup and long sleeves. The sound of raised voices through thin walls, the crash of breaking dishes, the sick feeling of helplessness that came with being too small to intervene. "Hey," Jenny said, noticing Sarah's distress. "He's just a jerk with daddy issues. Don't let him get to you." "I won't," Sarah said, forcing a smile. "Thanks for sitting with me at lunch. Anytime. And if Derek gives you any more trouble, just let me know. My older brother graduates from college this year, and he's coming home for Thanksgiving. He played football at state, and he's always looking for an excuse to put entitled high school boys in their place." Sarah appreciated the offer, but she knew that involving other people often made situations worse. Violence had a way of escalating, and innocent people got hurt when conflict spun out of control. She'd learned that lesson the hard way. The rest of the afternoon passed without incident, though Sarah noticed Derek and his friends watching her in the hallways. Their stares felt calculating, as if they were planning something. Sarah had dealt with bullies before, but there was something different about Derek. His type of entitlement, backed by family money and social position, could be more dangerous than simple aggression. After school, Sarah walked home through the quiet streets of Millbrook, taking note of the neighborhood layout and potential escape routes. Old habits from a childhood spent moving frequently and staying alert for danger. The house was empty when she arrived, her mother already at the hospital for her shift. Sarah made herself a simple dinner and settled down to homework, but her concentration kept drifting to the events of the day. Derek's behavior reminded her too much of the men her mother dated. The same sense of entitlement, the same belief that rejection was a personal insult that required correction. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "How was your first day, sweetheart?" "Good," Sarah typed back. "Made a friend. Everything's fine." It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either. Jenny seemed genuinely nice, and Sarah was cautiously optimistic about the friendship. As for everything being fine, that remained to be seen. That evening, as Sarah lay in bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of her new neighborhood, she thought about the promise she'd made to herself. No more running. No more watching her mother get hurt by men who saw kindness as weakness and independence as a challenge. She'd spent the last 2 years learning skills that most 17-year-old girls never needed to know. Self-defense classes at the community center, taught by a former military instructor who understood that sometimes the smallest students were the ones who needed the training most. Hours of practice in empty parking lots and basement gyms, learning to turn her size into an advantage rather than a liability. Sarah had hoped she'd never need to use what she'd learned. But as she drifted off to sleep, Derek Hoffman's face fresh in her memory, she suspected that hope might be premature. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of her resolve to protect herself and her mother. And if Derek and his friends were planning to escalate their harassment, they were about to discover that the quiet new girl was not quite what she appeared to be. The last thing Sarah remembered before falling asleep was her instructor's voice during her final lesson. The element of surprise is your greatest weapon. Let them underestimate you. Let them think they know what you're capable of. And when the moment comes, show them exactly how wrong they are. In the darkness of her new bedroom, Sarah Mitchell smiled slightly. Tomorrow was another day, and she was ready for whatever it might bring. The second week at Millbrook High brought with it the kind of October weather that made everything feel crisp and possible. Sarah had fallen into a routine that felt almost normal. Breakfast with her mother when their schedules allowed. Morning classes where she kept her head down and took careful notes. Lunch with Jenny and sometimes her small circle of friends. Afternoon classes. And then home to an empty house where she could think and plan in peace. Derek Hoffman had kept his distance since their confrontation in the cafeteria, but Sarah wasn't naive enough to think he'd simply forgotten about her. She'd caught him watching her in the hallways, and his friends had taken to making comments just loud enough for her to hear. Nothing overtly threatening, just the kind of psychological pressure designed to wear down someone's confidence over time. "You're being paranoid," Jenny said as they walked to their lockers after third period. "Derek's all talk. He's probably already moved on to some other poor girl to harass." Sarah wished she could share Jenny's optimism, but experience had taught her to trust her instincts about dangerous men. And everything about Derek Hoffman set off alarm bells in her mind. "Maybe you're right," she said, though she didn't believe it. "I know I'm right. My mom always says bullies are just cowards who haven't been called out properly yet." Sarah smiled at Jenny's faith in simple solutions. It was one of the things she liked most about her new friend. Jenny had grown up in a stable home with parents who loved each other and solved problems through communication rather than violence. It gave her an optimism that Sarah envied but couldn't quite embrace. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Coach Williams, the gym teacher who also coached the wrestling team. He was a bear of a man with graying hair and hands that looked like they could crush walnuts, but his expression was always kind when he spoke to students. "Sarah Mitchell," he said, consulting a clipboard. "Yes, sir. I understand you're not currently enrolled in any physical education classes." Sarah's stomach clenched. PE had been a nightmare at her previous schools, full of opportunities for humiliation and exposure. "I was hoping to focus on academic subjects this semester." "I appreciate that, but state requirements are state requirements. You need at least one semester of PE to graduate." Coach Williams' expression was sympathetic but firm. "I've got space in my fifth period class if you're interested." "What kind of activities?" Sarah asked, dreading the answer. "Bit of everything. Some basketball, volleyball, basic fitness training. Nothing too intense." He glanced at his clipboard again. "Although I notice on your transcript that you've had some martial arts training." "That true?" Sarah felt her face flush. She'd hoped that particular detail would go unnoticed. "Some. Nothing formal." "Well, we're starting a self-defense unit next week. Might be a good fit for you. Help some of the other students learn a few basic techniques." Coach Williams smiled. "Plus, I could use an assistant who actually knows what she's doing." Jenny's eyes lit up. That sounds amazing. I've been wanting to learn some self-defense moves. It's really not that big a deal, Sarah said quickly. Are you kidding? Jenny grabbed her arm excitedly. You know martial arts? And you never told me? What else are you hiding? Sarah forced a laugh, but inside she was calculating the complications this could bring. PE class meant changing in locker rooms, revealing the small scars on her ribs from that terrible night in Phoenix. It meant physical activity that could draw attention to her conditioning and reflexes. Most importantly, it meant demonstrating skills she'd hoped to keep secret. Think about it, Coach Williams said. I'll put you down as a tentative enrollment for now. You can start Monday if you decide you're interested. As he walked away, Jenny continued to pepper Sarah with questions about her martial arts background. Sarah deflected as best she could, claiming it was just a few classes at a community center, nothing serious, really not worth discussing. But she could see the curiosity in Jenny's eyes, and she knew her secret was beginning to unravel. The rest of the week passed quietly, with Sarah trying to decide what to do about Coach Williams' offer. The rational part of her brain said to decline, to find some excuse to avoid PE altogether. But another part of her, the part that was tired of hiding and pretending to be helpless, was tempted by the opportunity to help other students learn to protect themselves. Friday afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to her locker. Melissa Carter was everything Sarah was not: tall, blonde, popular, and dating the starting quarterback. She was also, according to Jenny, one of the few popular kids who wasn't completely terrible to social outcasts. Hi, Melissa said, her voice tentative. You're Sarah, right? The new girl. That's me. I was wondering if I could ask you something. Melissa glanced around nervously, as if making sure no one was watching. It's about Derek Hoffman. Sarah's attention sharpened. What about him? Jenny told me about what happened in the cafeteria last week. How you stood up to him. Melissa's voice dropped to almost a whisper. I was wondering if you could teach me how to do that. Teach you what? How to not be afraid of him. Melissa's perfect facade cracked slightly, revealing genuine fear underneath. He's been texting me, trying to get me to go out with him. When I said no, he started showing up places where he knew I'd be. My boyfriend graduated last year, and Derek knows I'm kind of on my own now. Sarah felt a familiar anger rising in her chest. It was the same pattern she'd seen too many times. A predator choosing victims based on perceived vulnerability. Have you told anyone? Parents, teachers? And say what? That Derek Hoffman is asking me out? Everyone would just say I should be flattered. Melissa's laugh was bitter. His family donates money to the school. Half the teachers act like he's some kind of golden boy. Sarah understood the impossible situation Melissa was describing. She'd watched her mother navigate similar dynamics with Marcus, whose charm and status in their old community made him seem like the perfect boyfriend to anyone who didn't live with him. What exactly do you want me to teach you? Just how to be brave like you were. How to look him in the eye and tell him to back off without being scared. Sarah considered the request carefully. Teaching someone confidence was different from teaching someone to fight, but the two were often connected. Real self-assurance came from knowing you could protect yourself if necessary. Meet me in the school parking lot after classes end, Sarah said. But understand something. What you're asking for isn't just about attitude. It's about being prepared for the consequences when you stand up to someone like Derek. What kind of consequences? The kind where he decides that your refusal is a challenge instead of an answer. Melissa's face paled, but her jaw set with determination. Then, I guess I'd better learn how to handle challenges. After school, Sarah found Melissa waiting by the bike racks, nervously checking her phone. The parking lot was mostly empty, with just a few students hanging around their cars or waiting for rides home. Okay, Sarah said, dropping her backpack on a nearby bench. First lesson. Confidence starts with posture. Show me how you normally stand when you're talking to someone. Melissa demonstrated, her shoulders slightly hunched, her weight shifted back on her heels, her arms crossed defensively in front of her body. Right, Sarah said. That's what we call victim posture. You're unconsciously making yourself smaller, signaling that you're not a threat and you're ready to retreat. Predators notice that kind of body language. So what should I do instead? Stand up straight. Shoulders back, but not tense. Weight evenly distributed on both feet. Hands at your sides or clasped behind your back, never crossed in front. Make eye contact when you speak, and keep your voice level and clear. Melissa practiced a new posture, and the change was immediately noticeable. She looked taller, more grounded, less like someone who could be easily intimidated. Better, Sarah said. Now, the most important thing to understand about people like Derek is that they're looking for specific reactions. They want to see fear, uncertainty, pleasing behavior. When you give them something different, it disrupts their script. What do you mean? Think about how most girls respond when Derek approaches them. They either get flustered and giggly because he's popular, or they get nervous and try to politely deflect his attention. Both reactions tell him that he has power over them. Melissa nodded, understanding beginning to dawn in her eyes. So, when Derek texts you or corners you at school, don't respond the way he expects. Don't make excuses or try to let him down easy. Don't apologize for not being interested. Just state your position clearly and then disengage. What if he doesn't take no for an answer? Then, you make it clear that continuing to pursue you after you've said no constitutes harassment, and harassment has consequences. They practice for another 20 minutes, with Sarah role-playing different scenarios Derek might try. By the end of the session, Melissa was standing straighter and speaking with more authority. This feels weird, Melissa admitted. I've been trained my whole life to be nice and accommodating. And there's nothing wrong with being nice, Sarah said. But there's a difference between kindness and allowing yourself to be mistreated. As they were packing up to leave, a familiar voice called out across the parking lot. Well, look what we have here. Derek Hoffman approached with his usual entourage, their expressions suggesting they'd been watching for several minutes. Sarah noticed that there were more of them than usual, not just Derek's regular crew, but some older boys she didn't recognize. Probably graduated students who still hung around the school because they had nothing better to do. Having a little girl talk? Derek's tone was mocking, but Sarah caught the undercurrent of anger. He'd clearly heard enough to understand what they'd been discussing. Just heading home, Melissa said, her voice only slightly shaky. See you later, Sarah. Hold on, Melissa, Derek said, stepping into her path. No need to rush off. I've been trying to reach you all week. I got your messages, Melissa said, her posture straightening as she remembered Sarah's lessons. I'm not interested in going out with you. Derek's smile faltered for a moment before returning, sharper this time. That's a shame. I thought maybe you'd reconsidered after having some time to think about it. I haven't. Maybe you need a little more time. She doesn't, Sarah said quietly, stepping up beside Melissa. Derek's attention shifted to her immediately. Nobody asked you, new girl. This is between me and Melissa. Actually, it's not between you and anyone, Sarah said. She's told you she's not interested. That should be the end of it. Derek's friends spread out slightly, and Sarah noticed that several of them were significantly larger than the boys she'd encountered before. These weren't just high school bullies. They looked like young men who had experience with real violence. You know what your problem is? Derek said, his voice taking on a harder edge. You don't understand respect. You come into our school, into our town, and you think you can just disrespect people who've been here their whole lives. I understand respect perfectly, Sarah said. I also understand the difference between respect and fear. Maybe it's time you learned that sometimes they're the same thing. The threat in Derek's voice was unmistakable now, and Melissa took an involuntary step backward. Sarah remained perfectly still, her body language calm, but alert. Are you threatening me? She asked. I'm educating you, Derek said. See, in a small town like this, people who don't fit and have a way of finding themselves very uncomfortable very quickly. And people who think they can intimidate others based on their daddy's money have a way of discovering that the world is bigger than their little kingdom. Derek's face flushed red, and for a moment Sarah thought he might actually lose control right there in the school parking lot. But he mastered himself, stepping back with a cold smile. You know what? You're right. The world is bigger than Millbrook. His gaze swept over both girls. But right now, you're in Millbrook. And in Millbrook, actions have consequences. Sarah had hoped to avoid serious conflict during her time in Millbrook, but Derek seemed determined to escalate the situation beyond simple high school drama. And if he was recruiting outside help, then he was planning something more dangerous than a typical bullying campaign. That night, as Sarah researched self-defense techniques on her laptop, her mother arrived home from her shift at the hospital. Linda looked exhausted, but happier than she'd been in months. The work was demanding, but it was honest work with honest people, and no one was asking her to compromise herself for the sake of keeping peace. "How was your day, sweetheart?" Linda asked, settling down on the couch beside her daughter. "Interesting," Sarah said, closing her laptop. "I might be helping with a self-defense class at school." Linda's expression immediately grew concerned. "Sarah, you promised me you were done with all that. We moved here to start fresh, to leave the violence behind." "This isn't about violence, Mom. It's about teaching people how to protect themselves. It's the same thing, and you know it. Every time you teach someone to fight, you're preparing for a fight." Sarah understood her mother's fear. Linda had spent too many years watching the men in her life solve problems with their fists, and the idea of her daughter following that same path terrified her. "Sometimes fighting is the only way to stop someone from hurting you," Sarah said gently. "You taught me that, remember?" Linda's hand went unconsciously to her ribs, where Marcus had left his mark during their final argument. "I never wanted you to have to learn that lesson, but I did learn it, and now maybe I can help other people avoid learning it the hard way." Her mother sighed, the sound heavy with years of accumulated pain. "Just promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you won't go looking for trouble." "I promise I won't go looking for it," Sarah said. "But if it comes looking for me, I'm going to be ready." Later that night, as she lay in bed listening to the sounds of her mother moving around the house, Sarah thought about Derek Hoffman and his escalating threats. She'd dealt with bullies before, but never in a small town where everyone knew everyone and family connections could protect people from consequences. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You made a mistake today." Some mistakes can't be undone. Sarah stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. But sleep was slow in coming, and when it finally arrived, it was filled with dreams of empty parking lots and the sound of approaching footsteps. Monday would bring new challenges, and Sarah suspected that her time of flying under the radar was rapidly coming to an end. Derek Hoffman had made his intentions clear, and the boys he'd brought with him suggested that he was serious about escalating the conflict. Sarah Mitchell had come to Millbrook hoping for a quiet senior year and a chance to heal from the trauma of her past. Instead, she was about to discover that sometimes the past followed you wherever you went, wearing different faces but carrying the same essential darkness. The question was no longer whether she would have to fight, but whether she was prepared for the kind of fight Derek Hoffman had in mind. And as Sarah finally drifted off to sleep, her last conscious thought was a promise to herself. Whatever came next, she would be ready for it. Monday morning arrived gray and cold with the kind of November wind that seemed to cut right through clothing and find every exposed bit of skin. Sarah dressed carefully, choosing clothes that would allow her full range of motion while still looking appropriately academic. She'd learned long ago that preparation was everything, and today felt like a day when preparation would matter. The threatening text from the weekend had been followed by two more, each more explicit than the last. Someone was watching her house, knew her schedule, and wanted her to know it. Sarah had considered telling her mother, but Linda was finally settling into a routine that made her happy. The night shift at the hospital kept her busy and fulfilled, and she was sleeping better than she had in years. Sarah couldn't bear the thought of destroying that peace with her own problems. At school, the atmosphere felt different. Students who usually ignored her now stared openly, and she caught fragments of whispered conversations that stopped when she passed. By third period, she understood why. Someone had been spreading stories about her, rumors designed to paint her as a troublemaker who thought she was better than everyone else. "They're saying you think you're some kind of tough girl," Jenny reported during lunch. Derek's been telling people you threatened him and Melissa in the parking lot Friday. That's not what happened. I know that, and you know that, but Derek's got a lot of friends who are willing to take his word over ours. Jenny looked troubled. There's also talk about you having some kind of criminal record. Something about violence at your old school. Sarah's stomach dropped. She'd been careful to keep her past hidden, but determined people with connections could find information if they looked hard enough. The incident in Phoenix had been self-defense, but the initial police report had made it sound like a mutual fight until the security camera footage cleared things up. It's not true, Sarah said. I didn't think it was. But people are believing it, and Derek's using it to justify whatever he's planning. Jenny's voice dropped to a whisper. My brother called me this morning. He heard from some friends that Derek's been asking around about you, trying to find out if you have any family or friends who might cause problems if something happened to you. The implications of that statement hit Sarah like a physical blow. Derek wasn't just planning to humiliate her or make her social life difficult. He was planning something that might require ensuring she had no support network to turn to afterward. Has he said anything specific? Not exactly, but Jake Morrison was bragging to his girlfriend about how they were going to teach the new girl some manners this weekend. And Jake's not the type to make empty threats. Sarah remembered Jake Morrison, the older boy with the military tattoos who had lingered in the parking lot Friday. If Derek had recruited someone with that kind of background, then the situation had moved far beyond typical high school drama. I need to go, Sarah said, standing up abruptly. Where? Coach Williams offered me a spot in his PE class. I think I'm going to take it. Jenny looked confused by the apparent non sequitur, but Sarah was already walking away. She needed to talk to an adult, and Coach Williams was the only teacher who had shown any interest in her beyond academic performance. She found him in his office, reviewing game footage from the wrestling team's latest match. He looked up when she knocked, his expression immediately shifting to concern when he saw her face. Sarah? Everything all right? Coach Williams, that PE class you mentioned, is the offer still open? Of course, but you look like you've got more on your mind than physical education requirements. Sarah hesitated. She'd spent so many years handling problems on her own that asking for help felt foreign and dangerous. But Jenny's warning about Derek's planning had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. There's been some tension with another student, she said carefully. Derek Hoffman. Sarah's surprise must have shown on her face, because Coach Williams smiled grimly. I've been teaching here for 15 years. I know when there's a problem brewing, and I know Derek's tendency to pick on students he perceives as weak. The coach leaned back in his chair. What's he been doing? Making threats, spreading rumors, getting his friends involved. His friends like who? Jake Morrison, for one. Coach Williams' expression darkened immediately. Jake Morrison graduated 3 years ago. He's not supposed to be on school property without permission. He studied Sarah's face carefully. Are you telling me Derek's recruiting adults to harass a high school student? That's what it looks like. That changes things significantly. Coach Williams reached for his phone. I need to make some calls. In the meantime, I want you to start attending PE class immediately. Today, if possible. Why? Because if Derek Hoffman is planning something stupid, he's going to do it off school property where he thinks there won't be witnesses or consequences. But if you're in my class, you'll be learning self-defense techniques that are part of the official curriculum. Nothing wrong with a student knowing how to protect herself. Sarah felt a wave of relief at finally finding an adult who understood the situation without requiring extensive explanation. There's something else, she said. I've had some martial arts training. More than I let on when you first asked. How much more? 2 years of intensive training. Karate, jiu-jitsu, some boxing. My instructor was a former Army Ranger who specialized in training smaller people to defend themselves against larger attackers. Coach Williams nodded slowly. That explains why you carry yourself the way you do. Most people wouldn't notice, but I know what to look for. He stood up and pulled a form from his filing cabinet. Fill this out, and you can start in my next class. We'll tell anyone who asks that you're helping me demonstrate proper technique. Will that help if Derek decides to escalate things? It'll help you, and It'll give me a reason to keep an eye on the situation without it looking like official intervention. His expression grew serious. But, Sarah, if this goes beyond verbal threats and intimidation, I need you to promise me you'll come to me immediately. Derek's family has influence in this town, but they don't have more influence than the law. Sarah agreed, though privately she wondered if Coach Williams truly understood how complicated these situations could become. Money and connections had a way of insulating people from consequences, especially in small towns where everyone knew everyone else's business. The rest of the day passed quietly, but Sarah could feel the tension building like pressure before a storm. Students who had been merely curious about her before now watched her with open hostility, influenced by whatever stories Derek had been spreading. Teachers seemed to regard her with suspicion, as if they'd been warned to keep an eye on the potentially dangerous new student. After school, Sarah made her way to the gym for her first PE class. Coach Williams had assembled a small group of students for the self-defense unit, mostly girls who had specifically requested the training, along with a few boys who seemed more interested in learning than in showing off. Today we're going to start with the basics, Coach Williams announced. Situational awareness, body language, and basic escape techniques. Sarah's going to help me demonstrate, since she's had some prior training. The class went well, with Sarah helping the other students practice proper stance and simple defensive moves. She was careful to downplay her skill level, offering just enough demonstration to be helpful without revealing the full extent of her capabilities. But she noticed that several students seemed distracted, frequently glancing toward the gym entrance as if expecting someone to arrive. Their nervousness was contagious, and by the end of class, Sarah felt like she was being watched by unseen eyes. As the other students filtered out, Coach Williams pulled her aside. "Good work today. How did it feel? Like I was performing for an audience I couldn't see." "Yeah, I got that impression too. Word's probably gotten around that you're helping with the self-defense class. Some people might not be happy about that." Meaning Derek, and whoever's backing him up. Coach Williams' expression was grim. "I made some calls after we talked. Jake Morrison's been hanging around town more than usual lately, and he's been seen with some of his old Army buddies. If Derek's convinced them that you're some kind of threat that needs to be dealt with, this could get very ugly very quickly." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November weather. Military-trained men who believed they were justified in using violence were a different category of threat entirely. "What do you suggest? Short term? Don't go anywhere alone, especially after dark. Long term? We need to find a way to de-escalate this before it goes too far. And if de-escalation doesn't work?" Coach Williams studied her face carefully. "Then, we make sure you're prepared for whatever comes next." That evening, Sarah arrived home to find her mother in the kitchen, preparing dinner with an energy and enthusiasm that had been missing for months. The job at the hospital was challenging, but rewarding, and Linda was rediscovering the confidence that years of abusive relationships had slowly eroded. "How was school, sweetheart?" "Interesting. I started helping with a self-defense class." Linda's smile faltered slightly. "I thought we agreed you were going to focus on academics. This is part of my PE requirement, and it's just basic safety techniques, nothing advanced." "Nothing advanced according to who? You, or the coach who doesn't know about your training?" Sarah sat down at the kitchen table, choosing her words carefully. "Mom, there are some students at school who've been giving me trouble. Learning to defend myself might be important." Linda immediately stopped chopping vegetables and turned to face her daughter. "What kind of trouble?" "The usual high school drama. Some boy who doesn't like being told no, and his friends who think intimidation is an acceptable way to get what they want." "How serious is it?" Sarah hesitated. She didn't want to lie to her mother, but she also didn't want to destroy the peace Linda had finally found. "Probably nothing I can't handle, but I want to be prepared just in case." Linda's face went pale. "Sarah, please tell me this isn't like Phoenix. Please tell me we're not going to have to run again." The pain in her mother's voice was almost unbearable. Linda had sacrificed so much for Sarah's safety over the years, giving up jobs and relationships and dreams of stability. The idea of having to uproot their lives again because of Sarah's problems was clearly devastating. "It's not like Phoenix," Sarah said firmly. "This is different. I'm different." "How are you different?" "I'm not a scared 13-year-old anymore. I know how to handle situations like this without letting them spiral out of control." Linda wanted to believe her. Sarah could see it in her eyes. But years of experience with violent men had taught her that situations like this rarely de-escalated on their own. "Promise me you'll be careful," Linda said finally. "I promise. And promise me that if it gets serious, you'll tell me immediately. No trying to protect me from the truth." "I promise that too." But as they sat down to dinner together, Sarah wondered if those were promises she'd be able to keep. Derek Hoffman seemed determined to escalate the conflict, and people like Jake Morrison didn't usually get involved in high school drama unless they expected it to become something more serious. Later that night, as Sarah reviewed her homework and tried to focus on normal teenage concerns like upcoming tests and college applications, her phone buzzed with another message from the unknown number. "Tomorrow after school. The old warehouse on Mill Street. Come alone, or your mother finds out exactly what kind of daughter she's been protecting." Sarah stared at the message for a long time, her heart racing. They were done with threats and intimidation. This was a direct challenge, backed by leverage that made refusal impossible. Whoever had sent the message knew about her mother's situation, knew that Linda's peace of mind was Sarah's greatest vulnerability. She thought about telling Coach Williams, thought about involving the police, thought about all the rational responses to a clear threat. But she also thought about her mother's face at dinner, the joy and hope that had been missing for so long. Sarah deleted the message and turned off her phone. Tomorrow she would go to the warehouse on Mill Street, and she would handle whatever Derek Hoffman and his friends had planned. But tonight, she would let her mother sleep peacefully, dreaming of a future that didn't include running from the past. In the darkness of her room, Sarah practiced the breathing techniques her instructor had taught her. Calm mind, loose muscles, clear thinking. She ran through scenarios in her head, considering different approaches and potential outcomes. 8 people, according to Jenny's count of Derek's usual group, plus Jake Morrison and his army friends. 8 against 1, in a location of their choosing, with the element of surprise on their side. By any rational assessment, the odds were impossible. But Sarah had learned something important during her years of training. Impossible odds didn't matter if you were fighting for the right reasons. And protecting her mother's newfound peace was worth any risk. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation she'd been dreading since her first day at Millbrook High. But tonight, for the first time in weeks, Sarah Mitchell slept soundly. She knew what she had to do, and she was finally at peace with the consequences. The quiet girl who had walked into Millbrook High, hoping to blend into the background, was about to disappear forever. In her place would stand someone harder, more dangerous, and absolutely committed to ending this threat once and for all. Derek Hoffman and his friends were about to learn that they had gravely underestimated their opponent. And by the time the lesson was over, none of them would ever make that mistake again. The warehouse on Mill Street had been abandoned for nearly a decade, its windows boarded up and its parking lot cracked with weeds pushing through the asphalt. It sat on the edge of Millbrook's small industrial district, far enough from the main part of town that screams wouldn't carry to anyone who might care to investigate. Sarah arrived at 4:30, exactly when a message had specified. She'd spent the day in classes trying to appear normal while her mind ran through every possible scenario she might face. During lunch, she'd quietly said goodbye to Jenny, though her friend didn't realize that's what it was. "See you tomorrow," Jenny had said cheerfully. "Yeah," Sarah had replied, hoping it was true. Now, standing outside the warehouse, Sarah took a moment to center herself. The breathing exercises her instructor had drilled into her came automatically. Slow inhale through the nose, hold for 3 seconds, exhale through the mouth. With each breath, her heart rate slowed, and her muscles relaxed into the ready state that marked the difference between panicking and fighting effectively. The main entrance was a heavy steel door with a broken lock. Sarah pushed it open and stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through gaps in the boarded windows. The warehouse was vast and empty, filled with shadows and the echoes of her footsteps on concrete. About time. Derek's voice came from the far end of the building, where a group of figures waited in a loose semicircle. Sarah walked toward them steadily, her pace neither hurried nor hesitant. As she got closer, she could make out the faces, Derek and his usual crew of 4, plus Jake Morrison and 3 other older men she didn't recognize. 8 total, just as Jenny had estimated. All of them larger than her, all of them clearly confident about the outcome of this encounter. "You came alone," Derek said, stepping forward from the group. "Good. Shows you understand the situation." "What situation is that?" Sarah asked, stopping about 10 feet away from the nearest person. "The situation where you've been causing problems since the day you arrived, and now it's time to teach you some respect." Sarah studied the group carefully, noting their positions and postures. Derek was trying to project confidence, but she could see the nervousness in the way he kept glancing at Jake Morrison for reassurance. The 3 older men had the loose, ready stance of people with combat experience. Jake himself stood perfectly still, his attention focused on Sarah with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. "Let me guess," Sarah said calmly. "You're going to rough me up a little, maybe take some pictures to share around school, make sure everyone knows what happens to girls who don't show proper respect to Derek Hoffman." "Something like that," Derek said with a nasty smile. "Although the details are still being worked out. And you really think 8 grown men beating up a 17-year-old girl is going to solve your problems?" "Who said anything about 8? Jake Morrison spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone used to being obeyed. "Derek's got some growing up to do. This is a learning experience for him." "Learning what?" "How to handle disrespect appropriately." Jake's smile was cold and professional. "See, Derek here thinks he's been insulted by some little girl who doesn't know her place. But me and my boys, we understand that respect isn't something you ask for. It's something you take." Sarah nodded slowly, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. This wasn't really about Derek's wounded ego anymore. Jake Morrison saw this as an opportunity to demonstrate his philosophy to an impressionable younger man, using her as the teaching tool. "So, this is a lesson in power dynamics. Smart girl. Too bad smart doesn't help when you're outnumbered 8-1. "Actually," Sarah said, her voice remaining perfectly level, "I count 8 Marines." The statement hung in the air for a moment before Jake Morrison laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the warehouse walls. "8 Marines? Honey, I'm the only Marine here. These other boys are Army, and Derek's kids are just punks with big mouths." "No," Sarah said quietly. 8 Marines. You just don't know it yet." Something in her tone made Jake stop laughing. For the first time since she'd entered the warehouse, Sarah saw uncertainty flicker across his face. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" Sarah took a step forward, her movement fluid and controlled. "It means you made a mistake, Jake. You researched my background, but you didn't research it thoroughly enough. You found out about Phoenix, but you missed the important part." "What important part?" "Why I was in Phoenix in the first place." Sarah's voice carried a new quality now, something that made even Derek shift nervously. "My stepfather was a Marine, Jake. Staff Sergeant Marcus Reed, Force Reconnaissance. Do you know what Force Recon does to people who hurt their families?" Jake's face went pale. "That's impossible." The report said what it needed to say to protect a minor's privacy. Sarah took another step forward. "But Marcus taught me everything he knew about close-quarters combat before he went too far with my mother, and I had to put him down." The silence in the warehouse was absolute. Sarah could see the doubt spreading through the group as they processed her words. "You're lying," Derek said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Sarah's posture shifted subtly, her stance becoming something that Jake Morrison recognized immediately. 8 months of daily training with a Force Recon Marine who specialized in teaching smaller soldiers how to neutralize larger threats. He called it David and Goliath tactics. "Bullshit," one of Jake's friends said, but he took a step backward as he said it. Sarah smiled for the first time since entering the warehouse, and it was not a pleasant expression. You want to know what Marcus taught me about fighting multiple opponents? Shut up, Jake said, his earlier confidence evaporating. He taught me that the key isn't to fight 8 people. The key is to fight one person 8 times, as fast as possible, before the others can react. Sarah's movement was so sudden that later, none of them would be able to describe exactly what happened first. One moment she was standing 10 feet away, talking calmly. The next moment, she was among them like a whirlwind of controlled violence. The first target was Derek himself. Sarah's instructor had drilled into her that in group situations, you eliminated the leader first, creating confusion and panic among the followers. Her right hand shot forward in a precise strike to Derek's solar plexus, doubling him over and driving all the air from his lungs. As he fell forward, her knee came up to meet his face, the impact dropping him unconscious to the warehouse floor. The whole sequence took less than 2 seconds. Jake Morrison was reacting, reaching for something in his jacket, when Sarah's spinning heel kick caught him in the temple. The blow was perfectly placed, designed to cause immediate disorientation without permanent damage. Jake staggered sideways, his hand falling away from his weapon as his vision blurred. 2 down in under 5 seconds. Derek's remaining friends rushed her simultaneously, their size and number creating the illusion of overwhelming force. But Sarah had trained for exactly this scenario hundreds of times. Instead of retreating or trying to create distance, she moved deeper into the group, using their size against them. The third attacker, a linebacker-sized boy named Trevor, threw a haymaker punch that would have knocked out most people. But Sarah wasn't there anymore. She'd slipped inside his reach, her elbow driving up into his ribs with surgical precision. The crack of breaking bones was audible across the warehouse as Trevor screamed and collapsed, clutching his side. The fourth attacker tried to grab her from behind, but Sarah had anticipated the move. She drove her head backward into his nose, feeling cartilage crunch under the impact. As he stumbled back, blood streaming down his face, Sarah spun and delivered a knife hand strike to his throat that dropped him choking to his knees. 4 down in 15 seconds. The remaining 4 men, Jake's army friends and Derek's last follower, had finally processed what was happening. They spread out, trying to surround her, their earlier confidence replaced by the grim determination of people who realized they were fighting for their lives. "She's just a kid," one of them said, as much to convince himself as the others. "Kids don't move like that," another replied, pulling out a knife. Sarah saw the blade and felt something cold settle in her stomach. Weapons changed everything, escalating the situation beyond simple assault into potentially lethal territory. But Marcus had prepared her for this too. "Put the knife down," she said quietly. "This doesn't have to get worse than it already is." "Screw that. You broke Trevor's ribs. Trevor will heal. But if you come at me with that knife, one of us isn't walking out of here." The man with the knife hesitated, seeing something in Sarah's eyes that made him reconsider his approach. This wasn't the expression of a scared teenager anymore. This was the cold calculation of someone who had crossed lines before and was prepared to do it again. "Dave, maybe we should," one of his friends started to say. But Dave had already made his decision. He lunged forward with the knife, aiming for Sarah's midsection in a move that would have been fatal if it had connected. Sarah's response was pure instinct, trained into her through months of repetitive drill. She sidestepped the blade while simultaneously grabbing Dave's wrist, using his momentum against him to drive him forward into her rising knee. The impact shattered his wrist, sending the knife clattering across the concrete floor. As Dave collapsed, screaming and cradling his ruined hand, Sarah turned to face the remaining 3 men. They had stopped advancing, finally, understanding that they weren't facing a helpless victim. "Anyone else want to escalate this?" she asked. Jake Morrison, still groggy from the kick to his head, struggled to his feet. "You little psycho. Do you have any idea what you've done?" I've defended myself against 8 people who lured me to an isolated location with the intent to assault me. Sarah's voice was perfectly calm. I'm pretty sure that's going to play well with local law enforcement. Law enforcement? You think anyone's going to believe that a 110-pound girl took down 8 grown men? Sarah pulled out her phone, which had been recording audio since she'd entered the warehouse. They'll believe the evidence. The blood drained from Jake's face as he realized the implications. Everything he and his friends had said, every threat they'd made, was now documented. Delete that, he said. No, delete it, or what? You'll assault me again? In front of witnesses this time? Jake looked around the warehouse, taking inventory of his situation. Derek was unconscious. Trevor was moaning and holding his ribs. Dave was cradling his broken wrist, and one of Derek's friends was still on his knees trying to breathe through his damaged throat. The remaining 3 men were backing toward the exit, clearly having no stomach for continuing the fight. This isn't over, Jake said, but the threats sounded hollow. Yeah, it is, Sarah replied, because in about 10 minutes, I'm going to call Coach Williams and tell him exactly what happened here. Then I'm going to call the police. Then I'm going to call my mother at the hospital and let her know that some adults lured her underage daughter to an isolated location for purposes that probably violate several federal laws. You can't prove. I can prove everything, Jake. Audio recording, your DNA under my fingernails from when I hit you, witnesses who saw us leave school together. Sarah gestured toward the men on the ground, plus medical evidence of the defensive wounds I inflicted. Jake's face went through several different expressions as he processed the legal implications of what had just occurred. Assault on a minor, conspiracy, probably weapons charges for the knife. His military record wouldn't protect him from that kind of prosecution. What do you want? He asked finally. I want you and your friends to leave Millbrook and never come back. I want Derek to transfer to a different school. And I want a written guarantee that no one connected to any of you will ever contact me or my family again. And if we don't agree, then I make that phone call, and you get to explain to a jury why 8 grown men thought it was appropriate to gang up on a teenage girl. Jake looked around at his injured companions, calculating odds and outcomes. Whatever he'd expected from this encounter, it wasn't this. The girl standing in front of him bore no resemblance to the quiet, seemingly helpless target they'd planned to intimidate. Fine, he said finally, but this story doesn't get out. No one hears about what happened here. That depends on you, Sarah said. As long as you keep your end of the agreement, I'll keep mine. Jake nodded curtly and began helping his injured friends to their feet. Derek was starting to regain consciousness, groaning and clutching his face where Sarah's knee had connected. Trevor needed help walking, his broken ribs making every breath painful. As they limped toward the exit, Jake turned back one last time. How, he asked. How did a kid learn to fight like that? Sarah's expression softened slightly, revealing a glimpse of the pain that had shaped her. When your mother keeps dating men who think violence is an acceptable way to solve problems, you learn to solve problems with violence. Marcus was just the first one who taught me to do it properly. Jake nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. Force Recon doesn't just teach combat techniques. No, they teach you how to win, no matter what the odds are. And what happened to Marcus? He learned that his student was a better fighter than he was. The finality in Sarah's voice ended the conversation. Jake gathered his people and left without another word, the warehouse falling silent except for the sound of their retreating footsteps. Sarah waited until she was certain they were gone before allowing herself to sit down on a crate near the warehouse entrance. The adrenaline that had carried her through the fight was beginning to fade, leaving her shaky and exhausted. She pulled out her phone and called Coach Williams. Sarah, where are you? I've been looking for you. I'm at the old warehouse on Mill Street. I need you to come get me. What happened? Derek and his friends decided to escalate things. They won't be a problem anymore. Are you hurt? Sarah looked down at herself, checking for injuries she might have missed in the heat of the fight. A few scrapes on her knuckles, a torn sleeve, nothing serious. No, I'm okay. What about them? They'll live. But they're going to need medical attention. Coach Williams was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. Sarah, please tell me you didn't. I defended myself. Everything I did was legal and justified. How many of them were there? 8. Another long silence. 8? Sarah, that's impossible. No, Coach. That's training. 20 minutes later, Coach Williams arrived with Principal Martinez and Officer Johnson from the Millbrook Police Department. Sarah gave them a complete account of what had happened, providing the audio recording as evidence, and explaining the weeks of harassment and threats that had led to the confrontation. By the time the ambulances arrived to treat Derek and his friends, the official story was clear. A group of older men had conspired to assault a minor, and she had defended herself with reasonable force given the circumstances. The fact that she had emerged uninjured while her attackers required medical attention was attributed to their underestimating her self-defense training and her superior knowledge of proper technique. Derek Hoffman was charged with conspiracy to commit assault on a minor. Jake Morrison and his friends faced federal charges for crossing state lines to participate in a crime against a child. The story made the local news, but Sarah's identity was protected due to her age, and the details of the fight were minimized to avoid encouraging copycat incidents. 3 weeks later, Sarah sat in the hospital cafeteria with her mother during Linda's dinner break. The charges against Derek and his friends were moving through the system, and Millbrook High had implemented new anti-bullying policies with Coach Williams' self-defense program as a mandatory part of the PE curriculum. "I'm proud of you," Linda said, reaching across the table to squeeze her daughter's hand. "For standing up for yourself, for protecting yourself, for handling everything so maturely." "Are you? Really? I thought you'd be disappointed that I couldn't find a peaceful solution." Linda's eyes filled with tears. "Sweetheart, I've spent years trying to shield you from violence, trying to pretend that the world was a safe place where good people could solve their problems with words and kindness. But you're stronger than I am. You've learned how to protect yourself and the people you love without becoming a bully yourself. Marcus taught me that the most important thing in any fight is knowing why you're fighting. And why were you fighting? To protect our peace. To make sure we didn't have to run anymore." Linda smiled through her tears. "Then you fought for the right reasons." That evening, Sarah returned to school for the first time since the warehouse incident. The hallways were different now. Students who had been hostile before now watched her with a mixture of respect and wariness. Teachers who had been suspicious now treated her with careful courtesy. Jenny found her at her locker before first period. "So," Jenny said with a grin, "how does it feel to be a legend?" "I don't know what you mean. Are you kidding? The story's all over school. The quiet new girl who took down 8 guys in 45 seconds. Jenny's expression grew more serious. "Is it true?" Sarah considered her answer carefully. "It's true that I defended myself against people who meant to hurt me. Everything else is just details. Well, whatever happened, Derek's gone, his friends are gone, and nobody's talking about giving anyone trouble anymore." Jenny closed her locker and shouldered her backpack. "I'd say that qualifies as a happy ending." As they walked to their first class together, Sarah reflected on Jenny's words. It wasn't really a happy ending. There was nothing happy about violence, even when it was necessary. But it was a resolution, and maybe that was enough. The girl who had walked into Millbrook High hoping to disappear had become someone impossible to ignore. But she had also become someone who could protect herself and the people she cared about, someone who wouldn't run when threatened, someone who understood the difference between necessary force and unnecessary cruelty. Sarah Mitchell had found her place in the world, and it was exactly where she'd started, standing beside her mother, protecting the peace they'd built together, ready to defend it against anyone who threatened to take it away. In the end, that was worth any number of fights. And if anyone else decided to test her resolve, they would learn what Derek Hoffman and Jake Morrison had learned, that sometimes the smallest person in the room is also the most dangerous, especially when she's fighting for something that matters more than winning. The quiet girl was gone, replaced by someone stronger, more confident, and absolutely committed to never being a victim again. And in the hallways of Millbrook High, that transformation was already becoming the stuff of legend.